The morning sun, both of them, rose over Miruk Colony like a pair of golden eyes opening slowly. The sky turned pink and then soft blue, and the fields of wheat and barley caught the light and held it like they were made of something precious. Children ran between the rows, laughing, chasing each other with sticks they pretended were swords. Their voices carried across the valley and mixed with the sound of water running through the little river the colonists had named Nakdong, after a river back on Earth that most of them had never seen. Miruk was not a rich colony. It was not important. It sat on the far edge of human space, a small green world that nobody in the galaxy paid attention to. 80,000 people lived there, and most of them were families, mothers, fathers, grandparents, and more children than any other human colony in the outer systems. People came to Miruk to raise kids. That was the whole point. It was quiet. It was safe. The biggest problem anyone had was the seasonal windstorms that knocked over fences and scattered laundry across the fields. Baek Jisoo stood at the front of her classroom and held up a leaf. It was wide and green, and she had picked it that morning from the garden outside the school. 12-year-olds sat in front of her, some paying attention, some drawing on their tablets, one boy sleeping with his mouth open. "This leaf," Jisoo said, "is doing something right now that every living thing on this planet depends on. Can anyone tell me what it is?" A girl in the second row raised her hand. "Photosynthesis." "Good. And what does that mean in simple words?" "It eats sunlight." Jisoo smiled. Close enough. She was about to explain the process in more detail when the lights flickered. Not the classroom lights. Those were solar-powered and stable. The lights on the emergency panel near the door. The little row of green indicators that nobody ever looked at because they had been green for as long as anyone could remember. They turned red. Jisoo stared at them. She had been trained on emergency protocols when she first arrived on Miruk 7 years ago. She remembered the instructor saying, in a bored voice, that the red lights meant orbital sensors had lost contact. "Probably never going to happen," the instructor had said. "But if it does, stay calm and wait for information." Jisoo stayed calm. She waited for information. The information came in the form of fire. The sky above Miruk split open like a wound. 200 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel, so close to the planet that the shockwave alone shattered every window in the colony's central district. The ships were massive, dark, covered in ridges and sharp angles. Draven Dominion military vessels, built for conquest, decorated with the trophies of 100 conquered worlds. There was no warning, no transmission, no demand for surrender, no explanation. They simply opened fire. The first bombardment hit the eastern district. Jisoo did not see it happen. She heard it. A sound so deep and heavy that it didn't feel like sound at all. It felt like the planet itself was screaming. The floor shook. Children screamed. The boy who had been sleeping was now very much awake, his eyes wide, his mouth still open, but for a different reason. Jisoo moved on instinct. She grabbed the emergency kit from the wall, pulled open the classroom door, and shouted at the children to follow her. Down the hall, down the stairs. Into the basement levels where the colony's emergency bunkers waited, dusty and unused, built by careful engineers who had hoped they would never be needed. Other teachers were doing the same thing. The hallways filled with children, small ones crying, older ones trying to be brave, all of them confused. Nobody knew what was happening. The sky outside the windows was wrong. It was full of light, but not sunlight. The light was orange and red, and it pulsed like a heartbeat. In the stairwell, Jisoo grabbed the hand of a girl who had frozen in place. The girl was 15, tall, with short hair and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to move. Her name was Shin Eunji. "Come with me," Jisoo said. "Don't look up, just walk." Eunji walked. She did not look up. But she heard everything. The explosions, the cracking of buildings, the sound of things falling that should never fall. Above them, the colony's small defense garrison did what it could. A young lieutenant activated the emergency shield over the central district. The shield was designed to protect against storms, not orbital bombardment. But it held. For 11 minutes, it held. In those 11 minutes, nearly 300 people made it into the deep bunkers. Then, the shield failed. The bombardment resumed. It was not strategic. It was not surgical. It was not aimed at military targets, because there were no military targets on Miruk. It was aimed at everything. The schools, the hospitals, the homes, the fields where an hour ago, children had been playing with sticks. In 45 minutes, Miruk colony was gone. 80,000 people had lived there that morning. When the Draven fleet pulled away, and the fires finally burned themselves out, fewer than 300 were still alive, huddled in deep bunkers beneath the ruins, breathing recycled air that tasted like ash and fear. From orbit, War Marshal Fennec watched the smoke rise from the planet's surface. He felt nothing. This was not cruelty to him. It was maintenance. Humans had expanded into space that the Draven Dominion considered theirs, and now the expansion had been corrected. He recorded a short message for the Galactic Concord, the alliance of species that kept order in the galaxy. The human presence in Draven claimed space has been corrected, he said. The matter is closed. He believed it. Far away, on Earth, in a quiet office in the city of Busan, Fleet Admiral Kang Do-hun received the casualty report. He read it once, he read it twice. He set it down on his desk. He removed his glasses and pressed his fingers against his eyes. He sat like that for a very long time. Do-hun was 57 years old. He had spent his career building things, schools on colony worlds, research stations, trading outposts. He had never fired a weapon in combat. The galaxy thought of him as a diplomat in a uniform. A soft man leading a soft species. He picked up the secure comm line on his desk. His hand was steady. His voice was steady. He said 5 words. Wake up the War Council. On Miruk, in a bunker 30 meters underground, Shin Unji sat against a concrete wall and held a stuffed animal she had grabbed without thinking during the evacuation. It was a small bear with one missing eye. She stared at the ceiling and listened to the silence above. The silence of a place where 80,000 people had been alive that morning and were not alive anymore. She had gone past crying into something else. A place that was quiet and cold and very, very still. A rescue ship arrived 18 hours later. When the doors of the bunker opened and the cameras caught Unji's face, ash-covered, hollow-eyed, clutching that one-eyed bear, the image was broadcast across the galaxy. 9 trillion sentient beings saw it. Most felt pity. Some felt uncomfortable. A few, quietly, felt afraid, though they could not yet explain why. On the Draven throne world, Grand Sovereign Olketh watched the broadcast. He was old, even by Draven standards, a massive reptilian figure with scales the color of dark iron and eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. He looked at the image of the human child, and he laughed. A short, dry laugh. They will cry, he said to his advisors. They will protest. They will send angry letters to the Concord. And then they will do nothing. That is what soft species do. He was wrong, but he would not understand that for some time yet. The alien ambassadors stationed on Earth noticed the silence first. It was not the silence of grief. Grief was loud. Grief meant crying, shouting, public displays of pain. They had expected that. They had prepared polite statements of sympathy and carefully worded calls for calm. But humanity did not grieve the way they expected. The morning after the news broke, the streets of every major city on Earth were quiet, not empty. People still went to work, still walked to shops, still rode trains, but they were quiet. They spoke in low voices. They looked at each other with a kind of understanding that needed no words. The alien ambassadors watched from their embassy windows and felt something they could not name. It was not fear exactly. It was the feeling of standing next to something very large that had just woken up. Fleet Admiral Kang Do-hun stood before the United Earth Parliament in a closed session. The chamber was full. He wore his uniform without medals, without decoration. He looked tired, and he did not try to hide it. He spoke simply. 3 days ago, the Draven Dominion attacked our colony on Myrick without warning or provocation. 79,712 people are confirmed dead. He paused. 34,000 of them were children. He let the number sit in the room. He watched it land on the faces of the parliament members. He watched some of them close their eyes. He watched others grip the edges of their desks. Then he said, "I am requesting full activation of Project Forge." The room went still. Project Forge was not something most parliament members had heard of. It had been drafted 60 years ago by military strategists who believed that humanity's peaceful reputation in the galaxy was an asset, but also a risk. If a hostile species ever decided to test that peacefulness, humanity would need a plan to transform itself from a civilization of builders into something else entirely. Something older. Something the species had spent centuries trying to forget. The plan was explained. The vote was taken. It was unanimous. Every single member voted yes. There was no debate. There were no objections. There was nothing to debate. The transformation began within hours. On Earth's moon, the Luna shipyards had spent decades building exploration vessels. Elegant, efficient ships designed to map stars and carry scientists to the far edges of the galaxy. Overnight, the production lines were torn apart and rebuilt. New blueprints were uploaded. New materials were delivered. Workers who had been building telescopes were now building guns. The first ship to come off the new line was a dreadnought, a warship 3 kilometers long, armored in layers of composite plating so thick that the engineers joked it could fly through a sun and come out the other side annoyed. They called it the Gwanggaeto class, named after an ancient Korean king who had expanded his empire across half a continent. The name was chosen carefully. It was a message. Across human space, retired soldiers re-enlisted by the millions. They did not need to be asked twice. They packed bags. They kissed families. They walked out of front doors without looking back. Han Tae-ho was one of them. He was 44 years old, and he had spent the last 10 years on a farming colony called Jeju-2, growing rice and vegetables, and living a quiet life that he had earned after 15 years of military service. He was big, broad-shouldered, with hands that were rough from soil and sun. His neighbors knew him as a gentle man who smiled easily and helped anyone who asked. The morning after the news, Tae-ho stood in his kitchen and stared out the window at his fields. The rice was almost ready for harvest. He had been planning to bring some to the market that weekend. He stood there for a long time, not moving. Then he washed his hands, put on his old uniform, and drove to the nearest military base. He did not tell his neighbors where he was going. He did not say goodbye. When he arrived at the base, the officer at the gate looked at his service record and immediately sent him to command. By the end of the day, he was leading the 4th Expeditionary Ground Division, 30,000 soldiers who had been farmers, teachers, engineers, and shopkeepers just 72 hours ago. Captain Yoon Nari was pulled from a routine patrol in the outer systems. She was 31, sharp-faced, with eyes that noticed everything and gave away nothing. She had been commanding a small patrol cruiser, chasing smugglers, and filing reports that nobody read. Now she was given command of the Silent Peak, a ship that officially did not exist. The Silent Peak was a stealth destroyer. It was fast, quiet, and packed with technology that the galaxy had never seen. because humanity had never had a reason to show it. For 100 years, human engineers had been developing weapons and systems that were filed away in classified archives, tested in secret, and never deployed. Not because they did not work, because humanity had chosen not to use them. That choice was over. While the military prepared, Baek Jisoo was brought to the Galactic Concord, the alliance of species that governed galactic affairs. She stood in a vast chamber, surrounded by representatives of over 300 species. Some were tall, some small, some made of shapes and colors that the human eyes struggled to understand. They watched her with curiosity, and what they thought was sympathy. Jisoo told them what happened. She spoke in a clear, steady voice. She described the bombardment. She described the bunkers. She described the sound of a planet dying. Then she began naming the children. Park Somi, age 7, Kim Hajun, age 9, Cho Yuna, age 11, Lee Minho, age 6. She named them one by one. 46 names, each one spoken clearly, carefully, as if she was calling attendance and expected them to answer. Ambassador Tilla, an insectoid representative from a neutral species, finally interrupted her. Not out of cruelty. Several delegates had left the chamber, unable to listen anymore. One species, that communicated through color, had turned a shade that their translators identified as deep anguish. The Concord issued a formal statement. It expressed deep concern and called for diplomatic dialogue between all parties. It was the kind of statement that sounded like something, but meant nothing. No sanctions, no intervention, no consequences. Kang Do-hoon read the statement in his office. He nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already known. He turned to his chief of staff and said, "Then we go alone." The chief of staff hesitated. The Concord will condemn unilateral action. The Concord condemned the death of 34,000 children with a press release, Do-hoon said. I can live with their disapproval. The fleet assembled, ship after ship after ship, rising from shipyards on Earth, on the Moon, on Mars, on colonies scattered across human space. 300 warships, more being built every day. Crews of men and women who had been living peaceful lives a month ago and were now loading weapons and running combat drills with a focus that made their instructors uneasy. The first Gwangaeto-class dreadnought rolled out of Luna shipyard on a Tuesday morning. It was enormous, a mountain of metal and fury, bristling with weapons that the galaxy had never imagined humans capable of building. On its hull, painted in white, were 34,000 small stars, one for each child. The shipyard workers stood in silence as it powered its engines. The sound was deep and heavy, a rumble that you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears. It shook the surface of the moon. It shook the air inside the viewing galleries. It shook something inside every person who heard it. Nobody cheered. Nobody clapped. They just watched it rise, slow and steady, into the black sky above the moon. And they understood, all of them, in their bones, that something had changed. Something old and terrible had woken up inside their species, and it was not going back to sleep until the work was done. Across the galaxy, in the comfortable halls of alien governments, intelligence officers began sending urgent reports to their leaders. The reports all said the same thing, in different words, in different languages, on different worlds. The humans are not grieving. They are building, and they are building things that are designed to kill. War Marshal Thenick was not a fool. He had fought 12 wars for the Draven Dominion, and won all of them. He had crushed species that were older, larger, and better armed than humans. He understood war the way a surgeon understands a body. Every part, every weakness, every place where a single cut could end everything. He studied humanity carefully. He read their history. He reviewed their military records. 100 years of peaceful exploration, scientific missions, minor skirmishes with pirates that barely counted as combat. Their fleet was small. Their soldiers were mostly engineers and researchers in uniform. They had no major battle experience. They had never fought a real war in space. Fennec positioned 500 warships along the border of Draven space. He was confident. His ships were veterans. His crews had tasted blood. He estimated that the humans would arrive angry, disorganized, and emotional. He would punish those mistakes. The war would be short. He told Grand Sovereign Olketh that the matter would be resolved in 2 weeks. The first sign that something was wrong came on a quiet night, 6 weeks after the Mirak massacre. 3 Draven border outposts, military stations positioned along the frontier, went silent at exactly the same time. No distress signal, no explosion, just silence. Fennec sent scout ships to investigate. They arrived expecting wreckage. What they found was worse. The stations were intact. The crews were alive, all of them unconscious, slumped at their posts like they had simply fallen asleep at the same moment. Medical scans showed they had been exposed to a chemical agent that was unknown to Draven science, something that put them to sleep gently, without harm, as if someone had tucked them into bed. Every computer on all 3 stations had been opened, read, and copied. Fleet positions, supply routes, communication codes, defense plans, everything. Captain Yoon Nari and the Silent Peak had done this. 1 ship, 1 crew, 1 night. They had slipped past Draven sensors like a shadow passing through a room, disabled 3 stations without killing a single person, stolen everything worth stealing, and vanished before anyone noticed. Fennec stared at the report for a long time. He was not a fool, and fools were the only ones who did not feel fear when they should. He adjusted his strategy. He pulled his fleet into a tighter formation around the Koreth system, a major Draven military hub, with shipyards, weapons factories, and a population of 2 billion civilians. If the humans wanted to fight, they would have to come to him, and they would have to fight on his terms. The human fleet arrived 2 days later. 300 ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Koreth system. They arranged themselves in a formation that Draven tactical computers did not recognize. Not because it was complex, but because it was simple in a way that made no sense. The ships were spread wide, with gaps between them that looked like weaknesses. Fennec's officers identified at least a dozen points where a quick strike could break the formation apart. Fennec smiled. 500 against 300. He ordered attack formation. Then Kang Do-hoon did something that no military commander in galactic history had ever done at the start of a battle. He opened a broadcast, not to the Draven fleet, to the Draven civilians on the planet below. His face appeared on every screen, every communication device, every broadcast system on Koreth. He spoke in Draven, translated perfectly, his voice calm and steady. People of Koreth, I am Fleet Admiral Kang Do-hoon of the United Earth Defense Force. We are not here for you. We are here for the ones who killed our children. Stay in your homes. Turn off your defense systems. No civilian will be harmed. You have my word as a human being. On the bridge of his flagship, Fennec slammed his fist against a console. The broadcast was an insult. It was also, he realized with a cold feeling in his stomach, a threat. Not to the civilians, but to him. Do-hoon was telling the galaxy, in real time, that humanity was making a promise. If any civilian died, it would be because the Draven military used them as shields. Fennec ordered his fleet to engage. The battle began. It was supposed to be quick. It was not. The human fleet fought like nothing the Draven had ever seen. Those gaps in the formation that looked like weaknesses were traps. When Draven ships pushed through them, the human ships on either side executed micro-jumps. tiny faster-than-light hops that moved them thousands of kilometers in the blink of an eye, and appeared behind the attackers. Draven ships that thought they were charging into a weak point suddenly found themselves surrounded. The electronic warfare was worse. Human ships broadcast a storm of false signals, fake sensor readings, and ghost images that turned Draven targeting systems blind. Fenix crews were firing at ships that were not there, while the real ones closed in from angles they could not see. And then there were the Guangato-class dreadnoughts. The first time a Draven battlecruiser fired a full salvo at a Guangato, the crew expected to see it shatter. The dreadnought absorbed the hits like a mountain absorbing rain. Its armor glowed white where the shots landed, and it kept coming. It kept coming, and it did not stop until it was close enough that its weapons could not miss. The humans fought at close range, dangerously, recklessly close. They treated their own ships like fists. They took damage so they could get close enough to deliver damage that was worse. It was brutal. It was ugly. It was effective. 4 hours. That was how long the battle lasted. 200 Draven warships were destroyed. 150 surrendered. The rest scattered into deep space. The human fleet lost 40 ships. 40 out of 300. It was the most one-sided major fleet battle in 1,000 years of galactic history. And it went in the direction that nobody, not the Draven, not the Concord, not any of the hundreds of species watching, had predicted. When it was over, Kang Do-hoon gave his second order of the day. Hold position. No ship fires on the planet. Not one shot. Not one. Not a single weapon was aimed at Korith. 2 billion Draven civilians watched from their windows as the human fleet hung in orbit above them. Weapons silent, lights steady. Some of them had been preparing to die. Some had been praying. Some had been hiding their children in basements, the way human parents had hidden their children on Mirok. None of them were harmed. In the Galactic Concord chambers, Ambassador Tilla watched the battle footage on a screen the size of a building. She watched the human ships execute maneuvers that should not have been possible. She watched the dreadnoughts absorb fire that would have destroyed any ship in the Concord's registry. She watched the Draven fleet, a fleet that had conquered dozens of species, break and scatter like startled animals. Then she watched the humans hold their fire over a civilian world, exactly as they had promised. She turned to a colleague, a tall, thin being from a species known for their calm, and whispered something. Her colleague, who had never shown surprise in 200 years of diplomatic service, went very still. What Tilla had said was, they were holding back. This whole time, they were holding back. Across the galaxy, intelligence agencies worked through the night. Files on humanity were pulled from archives and reread with new eyes. Trade records were examined. Scientific publications were reviewed. Technology patents were analyzed. And slowly, with a growing sense of horror, they began to understand something. Humanity had not been peaceful because it was weak. It had been peaceful because it had chosen to be. And the things it had built while being peaceful, the technologies it had developed, the weapons it had designed and never used, the strategies it had planned and filed away, were not the products of a species that did not know how to fight. They were the products of a species that knew exactly how to fight, and had been hoping it would never have to. That hope was gone now, and the galaxy was beginning to realize that the quiet, garden-building, school-teaching, soft-spoken humans were the most dangerous thing in the universe. Not because of what they could destroy, but because they had spent a century preparing for a war they never wanted. And now that it was here, they were fighting it with the calm, patient, terrifying efficiency of a species that had been ready all along. The galaxy had seen wars before. It had seen species conquer, enslave, burn, and exterminate. It had seen cruelty so vast that entire civilizations had been erased from history, like words wiped from a board. War, in the experience of most galactic species, was a simple thing. You were strong, so you took. You won, so you ruled. The defeated were meat, and the victors ate well. Humanity fought differently, and it confused everyone. Han Teho landed on the Draven colony world of Tessic 4 with 30,000 soldiers on a gray morning. The planet's military garrison had 18,000 troops, dug into fortified positions around the capital city. Teho studied the defense layout from orbit, planned his approach for 2 hours, and then launched his assault at dawn. The battle for the capital lasted 9 hours. Teho's forces moved through the city in small, fast teams, hitting military positions with overwhelming force, and then moving before the enemy could regroup. They were precise. They were brutal. They cleared fortified buildings with grenades and close-range fire. They did not hesitate, and they did not stop. By afternoon, the Draven garrison had surrendered. Then something happened that the surviving Draven soldiers did not understand. The humans set up medical stations, not for themselves, for the Draven wounded. Human medics, the same ones who had been carrying rifles an hour ago, knelt beside injured Draven soldiers and treated their wounds. They cleaned burns, they set broken bones, they administered painkillers from their own supplies. On the second day, food distribution began. The battle had disrupted the city's supply lines, and civilian neighborhoods were running low. Teho ordered his logistics teams to open their own ration stores and distribute food to the Draven population. Human soldiers stood in the streets, handing out meals to people whose army they had just defeated. A Draven journalist who had been embedded with the retreating garrison filmed a scene that would be seen across the galaxy. A human soldier, a young woman with dirt on her face and blood on her sleeve, was sitting on a broken wall, sharing her lunch with a Draven prisoner of war. The prisoner was 3 times her size, with scales and claws and teeth that could bite through metal. He ate the food carefully, watching her with eyes that held something between confusion and something else. The footage spread across every news network in the galaxy. 9 trillion beings watched a human soldier feed her enemy. On the Galactic Concord floor, Ambassador Tilla played the footage for the full assembly. She did not add commentary. The room was silent for a long time after the clip ended. 3 species that had been quietly supplying the Draven Dominion with weapons announced within the same hour that they were ending all shipments. Teho himself became famous for something he did on the 3rd day. During a sweep of a damaged neighborhood, his unit found a collapsed building with survivors trapped inside. Most of the survivors were Draven children from a school that had been too close to a military position. Teho called in every available soldier and spent 6 hours digging through rubble with his bare hands. He pulled out 11 children. Cameras caught him carrying one of them, a small Draven child with a broken arm, to a field hospital. The child was crying. Teho held her the same way he used to hold newborn calves on his farm, gently and close to his chest, murmuring words she could not understand. When a reporter asked him why he was helping the enemy's children, Teho looked at her with genuine confusion and said, "They are not the enemy. They are children." The galaxy did not know what to do with this. In their experience, armies that fought with this kind of violence did not also build hospitals for the defeated. Species that could destroy fleets did not carry children. You were either a warrior or a caretaker. You could not be both. Humanity was both, and that was more frightening than the warships. Deep in Draven space, Grand Sovereign Olketh watched his empire crack. World after world fell or surrendered. His allies abandoned him. His treasury was drained. His military, once the most feared force in the sector, was broken. He called War Marshal Fennec to the throne room and gave an order that made even Fennec, a soldier who had destroyed civilizations, go pale. Olketh wanted the forbidden weapons deployed. Planet crackers, bioweapons, devices that had been banned by galactic treaty for 1,000 years because they were not weapons of war, they were weapons of extinction. Fennec stood in the throne room, and for the first time in his career, said no. Not because he was moral. Fennec had no particular attachment to morality. He said no because he was a strategist, and he had been watching the humans carefully, and he had noticed something. Every time the Draven escalated, the humans escalated harder. When the Draven fortified, the humans outflanked. When the Draven ambushed, the humans adapted within hours. The humans were learning. Every trick worked once and never again. Fennec looked at his sovereign and said, "If we use those weapons, we will not destroy them. We will only make them angrier. And I do not want to see what they do when they are angrier." Olketh stared at him for a long moment. Then he drew a sidearm and shot Fennec dead. The war marshal fell and did not get up. Olketh stepped over his body, took command of the remaining fleet, and began preparing his own strategy. He was old, he was desperate, and he was no longer thinking clearly. But he still had ships, and he still had the throne world of Vecurus, the most fortified planet in Draven space. Meanwhile, Bake Jisoo had been working with military intelligence on Earth. She had gone over the data from Miruk 1,000 times. The attack pattern, the timing, the way the Draven ships had positioned themselves. Something about it bothered her. The attack was too thorough, too planned for a simple border dispute. It was not a punishment. It was a test. She was right. The intelligence teams confirmed it. Maruk had been chosen deliberately. It was small, isolated, and full of families. Olketh had wanted to see what humanity would do when struck at its most vulnerable point. If humanity collapsed, cried, and begged the Concord for help, Olketh would have known they were weak enough to exterminate entirely. He had been planning a full campaign against every human world. Maruk was not the end. It was supposed to be the beginning. When this information was released to the public, Earth went quiet again. That same silence. That terrible, focused, ancient silence that the alien ambassadors had learned to dread. It was the silence of a species that had just learned its children had been killed as an experiment. Admiral Kang Do-hoon called his commanders together for the final time. The map on the wall showed one target. The Draven throne world, Vecurus. Olketh had gathered every remaining ship there. 800 vessels. A planetary defense grid that could turn the sky into fire. Do-hoon gave his final order before the fleet jumped. He stood in front of his officers and spoke in his usual quiet voice. "No orbital bombardment. We do not burn their world. We go down there and we face them. They will see us as we are." A junior officer raised his hand and asked, respectfully, if that was wise. Landing troops on the most heavily defended planet in Draven space would cost lives. A lot of lives. Do-hoon looked at him and said, "If we burn their world from orbit, we are what they said we are. Soft creatures who became monsters. If we go down and fight, and we win, and we do not destroy what does not need to be destroyed, then we are something they have never seen, and they will never forget it." The fleet prepared to jump. 600 human warships, and for the first time, ships from 3 alien species that had broken their neutrality to stand with humanity. Not because they owed humanity anything, because they had watched the footage. They had seen the soldiers feeding prisoners. They had seen Taeho carrying the child, and they had decided, quietly, that they wanted to be on the side that did those things. Before the jump, Shin Eunji, now 16, thin, with eyes that looked older than her face, recorded a message. It was broadcast to every ship in the fleet. She sat in front of a camera and spoke in a voice that did not shake. "I remember their names, all of them. I need you to make sure the galaxy remembers too." 630 ships jumped to Vecurus, the sky above the throne world filled with light. The Battle of Vecurus began at dawn. measured by the throne world's slow-turning sun, and it began badly for everyone. Olketh had gathered everything, 800 warships, arranged in a layered defense grid so dense that nothing should have been able to get through. The planet itself was wrapped in a shield system powered by generators buried deep underground, each one the size of a small city. The orbital defense platforms, massive weapon stations hanging in space like iron moons, could fire beams hot enough to cut a ship in half from 100,000 kilometers away. The human fleet arrived and immediately took losses. 2 ships were destroyed in the first minute. The orbital platforms filled the space around Vakaris with fire, and the Draven fleet surged forward to meet the attackers head-on. Kang Do-hoon stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Hala, and watched the opening exchanges with the same calm he had maintained through every battle. His staff moved around him in controlled urgency, calling out numbers and positions. Do-hoon listened to all of it and said very little. He was waiting for something. He was waiting for Yun-Nari. The Silent Peak had jumped separately from the main fleet, arriving 2 hours earlier in the shadow of Vakaris' largest moon. Nari and her crew had spent those 2 hours drifting silently through the debris field that orbited the moon, running on minimal power, invisible to every sensor the Draven had. Now, as the main battle drew every Draven ship and every sensor forward, Nari moved. The Silent Peak slipped through the gaps in the defense grid like a needle through cloth. It was the most dangerous maneuver Nari had ever attempted. One wrong calculation, one stray sensor sweep, and her ship would be caught in the open, with the firepower of an empire pointed at it. She did not make a wrong calculation. The ship reached the planet's upper atmosphere and dove. Nari's target was the primary shield generator, a massive installation on the northern continent, protected by ground forces and anti-aircraft batteries. As long as it operated, the planetary shield would hold, and no ground troops could land. The Silent Peak came in fast and low, skimming the tops of mountain ranges, using the terrain to hide from radar. The anti-aircraft batteries opened fire when she was 30 seconds from the target. Her ship shook. Alarms screamed. A section of the hull breached and her navigator was thrown from his seat. She fired everything the Silent Peak had, every missile, every beam, every weapon on the ship, into the shield generator. The explosion was visible from orbit. The planetary shield flickered and died. The Silent Peak, its weapons empty, its hull torn open in 3 places, pulled up from the attack run, and immediately came face to face with a Draven dreadnought that had broken from the orbital battle to intercept. The dreadnought was 10 times the Silent Peak's size. Nari looked at it through the cracked viewport of her bridge. Her left arm was broken. Her console was sparking. Half her crew was injured. She said, "Full speed, ram it." The Silent Peak hit the Draven dreadnought amidships at full acceleration. The impact crumpled the stealth destroyer's bow like paper, and tore a hole through the dreadnought's midsection so large that secondary explosions ripped through 6 decks. The Silent Peak, what was left of it, spun away into a decaying orbit. Nari was unconscious. Her first officer, a young man named Ko Sung-ho, had been ordered to evacuate the crew before impact. He had refused. The entire bridge crew had refused. When asked later why he disobeyed a direct order, Sung-ho said simply, "We do not leave our captain. That is not how we do things." They pulled Nari from the wreckage alive. Barely. Her heartbeat was faint, and her breathing was shallow, but she was alive, and the shield was down. Kang Do-hoon received the confirmation on the Hala's bridge. He closed his eyes for 1 second. Then he opened them and gave the order. "All ground forces, begin landing." Han Taeho's transports dropped through the atmosphere like stones. The Draven ground forces opened fire before they landed. The first wave took heavy casualties. Soldiers died in transports that never reached the ground. Others landed in the wrong zones and had to fight their way through kilometers of enemy territory to reach their objectives. But they kept coming. Wave after wave after wave. and they fought the way they had fought on every world, with savage, relentless precision aimed only at military targets. The battle on the ground lasted 3 days. It was the worst fighting of the war. Street by street, block by block, building by building. Taeho led from the front, as he always did, walking through fire with the same patient determination he had once used to clear fields of stones on his farm. He did not shout. He did not give speeches. He simply moved forward, and his soldiers moved with him, because they trusted him the way you trust the ground under your feet. And through all of it, the same rule held. Civilians were not harmed. Buildings that held only families were marked and avoided. Draven civilians who stumbled into combat zones were escorted to safety by human soldiers who minutes earlier had been killing Draven troops with their bare hands. On the 3rd day, Taeho's forces reached the Grand Sovereign's palace. It was an enormous structure of black stone and iron, built to last 1,000 years, and to remind everyone who saw it that the Draven dominion was eternal. The palace guard fought hard. They were Olketh's personal soldiers, the best the Dominion had, loyal to the point of death. Many of them found it. But Taeho's people were fighting for something that loyalty alone could not match, and by evening the palace doors were breached. Taeho walked through the halls with a squad of soldiers at his back. The palace was vast and cold, built for a species that valued power above comfort. Statues of past sovereigns lined the corridors, each one larger and more imposing than the last, a history of conquest carved in stone. They found Olketh in the throne room. He was alone. His guards were dead or surrendered. He sat on his throne, a massive chair of dark metal, and waited. He was very old, and he was not afraid. He had lived long enough to see the end of things, and he intended to meet it standing. When the doors opened and the humans entered, he rose to his full height, towering over all of them, and spread his arms. He was waiting for the shot. In Draven culture, a defeated sovereign was killed by the victor. It was tradition. It was honor. He expected nothing less. Taeho walked up to him. He was covered in dust and sweat and other people's blood. He looked up at Olketh, who was nearly 3 meters tall, and held his gaze. Then he removed his helmet. He spoke clearly, so that every recorder in the room could hear. You do not get to die like a warrior. You killed children. You get to live, and you get to answer for it. Olketh's eyes widened. Of all the things he had expected, this was not one of them. Dying, he understood. Living as a prisoner, living to face judgment, living to be shown to the galaxy as a defeated old man who slaughtered children, was something worse than any death. Taeho handcuffed him, gently, the way you would handle something fragile, and Olketh, for the first time in his very long life, had nothing to say. The war ended in 14 weeks. The Draven Dominion was dismantled, but not destroyed. Humanity, working with the Galactic Concord, which had finally belatedly found its courage, established a transitional government for the Draven people. War crimes tribunals began. Olketh was tried before a galactic court, in full view of the galaxy, and the evidence was so overwhelming that even species who had once called him an ally could not look away. Baek Jisoo testified. She stood before the court and named the children again. This time she named all of them, every single one, 34,000 names, read over the course of many days, in a voice that did not waver. Nobody asked her to stop. A memorial was built on Miruk. It was a garden, because that was what humans did. They planted things. They grew things. Even on the ashes of the worst thing that had ever happened to them, they put seeds in the ground and waited for green. The memorial listed every name. At its center stood a statue of a child, holding a stuffed animal with one missing eye, looking up at the sky. Kang Do-hoon retired. He went back to Earth, to a small town outside Busan, and opened a school. He taught history to 14-year-olds who thought he was just a quiet old man with glasses. A journalist found him there and asked him one question. Why did humanity fight the way it did, with so much violence and so much mercy at the same time? Do-hun was quiet for a long time. He looked out the window of his classroom at the trees moving in the wind. Then he said, "Because we have done terrible things. We know what cruelty looks like. We invented most of it. And we decided, a long time ago, that if we ever had to become that thing again, we would do it with open eyes, and we would stop the moment it was done. That is the other side of humanity. Not that we can destroy. Any fool with a match can destroy. It is that we choose, every single time, to rebuild." Yun-Nari recovered. It took months. She walked with a limp for the rest of her life, and her left hand never fully closed again. She returned to service, and was given command of a new ship, a deep space exploration vessel. She spent the rest of her career mapping stars and discovering new worlds, and never fired another weapon. Han Taeho went back to his farm. He harvested the rice that had been waiting for him. His neighbors asked him where he had been. He said he had been away on business. He never spoke about the war unless someone asked, and even then, he said very little. He was the same gentle, smiling man he had always been. The only difference was that sometimes late at night, he would stand in his fields and look up at the stars for a very long time. Shin Eun-ji enrolled in the United Earth Defense Force Academy the year she turned 17. She was quiet, focused, and carried herself with a stillness that made her instructors pay attention. On her application, under the question "Reason for Enlistment," she had written one line. "So no one ever has to close their eyes again." The galaxy watched, the galaxy remembered, and the galaxy learned something it would never forget. That the species that built gardens and taught children and carried the wounded was the same species that could break an empire in 14 weeks. Not because they were cruel, not because they loved war, but because they loved other things more. And when those things were taken from them, there was no force in the universe that could stand in the way of their answer. They were humans. They built things. And when someone destroyed what they built, they did not just rebuild. They made sure it would never be destroyed again.